to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we're going to talk all about the bishops. Bishops are very good pieces. They are worth 3 points, as we know, the same as knights. In the position we see on the board, we see a bishop for white and a knight for black, in addition to the pawns and the kings. I'd like to tell you about the difference between those two minor pieces, the bishop and the knight. While they are the same value on the point scale, that is 3 points each, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of having a bishop is that the bishop is a long-range piece. That is, let's say from where it is right now on G2, it can go as far as all the way to the other corner on A8. The disadvantage of the knight compared to the bishop is that the knight is a relatively slow piece, and unlike the bishop, it would take a number of moves with the knight, let's say going to D7 and then to B6, just to arrive to that same square. Would that be the goal? In this specific position that we see on the board right now, white can take advantage of the fact that the bishop can make such a long moves. No, the bishop should not move all the way to the corner, but it should move one square less to B7, attacking black's pawns that are on the light squares. And as I just mentioned, the knight is a slow piece, and the knight cannot get, let's say, to B8 or C7, from which squares the knight would be protecting that pawn on A6. The knight cannot get to any of those squares in just one move. It would take the knight at least 2 moves, for example, getting to C7, but it would be a bit too late because the bishop then would capture the pawn, and when the knight comes to C7, protecting the second pawn, then the white bishop would move back simply to B7, and then white's pawn is pretty unstoppable, moving forward with the help of the bishop on B7, controlling not only the promotion square, but also the A6 square, which will be white's route for the pawn to get promoted. So basically what would end up happening in such situation, black would, let's say, try to bring his king, white would push the pawn, black could bring the king closer, the pawn would advance again, and the pawn gets promoted. And then after that, the knight would have to capture, and white would end up winning a piece. That is trading his a-pawn for black's knight. Let's move on to the next position, which looks a lot similar to the previous one, but it's very, very different in reality. First of all, in this position, it's black's turn. Also, you can notice that in this case, the pawns on the queen side are located differently, and at a major difference. Here, the pawns that white has on the light squares are on the same color as white's bishop. Typically, that's best to avoid, especially in a situation when the opponent's pawns are on the opposite color squares, that making this bishop on G2 kind of useless, because on one hand, the bishop cannot attack black's pawns that are highlighted with the arrow, with a yellow arrow on B4 and C5. And the only thing that bishop can do, if it gets there on time, is to protect his own pawns, but without having any targets. Being black on the move in this position, black would move his knight to D4 attacking white's pawn on b3, and as you can see, white is unable to defend that pawn. Let's move on a little bit and talk about the strengths of the bishop when it comes to attacking. In this following position, black has just moved his queen to d5, offering a trade of queens. If the white queen would capture black's queen, the black bishop from e6 would recapture. That is, the black bishop is defending that queen. On the other hand, we can see white's bishop pasting over the long diagonal b2 through h8, and black has a weakness by the pawn already moved to g6. In this situation, white can work together efficiently, the bishop and the queen. And I'd like you to remember this pattern, this idea. When a bishop and the queen can have such a pattern, the bishop being behind and the queen in the front, it can be a very devastating threat to the opponent. In this case, white is threatening to checkmate on g7 or on h8. And black is pretty much helpless against it. Moving, for example, the rook away wouldn't help. White would have the choice of checkmating with the queen on g7 or in the corner on h8. Moving on to the next example, it shows the power of a pair of bishops. The advantage of the bishop, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's a long-range piece, that it can make long moves. The disadvantage of the bishop, on the other hand, is that the bishop is limited to its own color. So if a bishop starts out on dark squares, it will always have to remain on dark squares throughout the entire game. Or, of course, a bishop starting out on f1, for example, on the light squares, will end up the whole game only moving along the light squares. On the other hand, when one side has both bishops and the other doesn't, it's typically an advantage. In the position we see on the board, white can very nicely have their bishops work together by first checking black's king with the bishop on c3. Well, black could block that check, but that would result in losing the bishop for no reason. So black needs to move the king to g8, and now the second bishop along the light squares gives a check again, and now the king has no escape except, that is, blocking the check, but that means giving up the knight, and now white is a bishop ahead and in a winning position. We're moving on to the next example. I would like to show you now various examples on how the bishop can be used for different tactical motives, such as the pin, the skewer, or discovery. First, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of pin. The bishop is an ideal piece to pin with. In this case, the bishop would move to c4, and as you can see, black has his king and queen lined up on the same diagonal as our bishop. What happens here is that the queen that's being attacked on e6 cannot move away anywhere other than staying on this very diagonal, because that would leave black's king in check. And that, of course, is not allowed by the rules. So black's choice is to capture the bishop, in which case black would lose a queen for a bishop. And as we know, that's quite a significant loss, losing a 9-point value piece for a 3-point value piece. And also moving the queen to f7 would result the same loss after bishop takes queen, king takes bishop. Let's see another example. Here we have equal material at the moment. White has a bishop versus the knight, but as you can notice, the black king and the knight are again on the same diagonal, and that often can be cause of trouble, like here. The white bishop would move to d4 and again creating a pin over black's knight on e5. That knight cannot move at all because it would leave black's king in check, and that's illegal. That would be an illegal move. And sadly for black, black has no way to protect the knight either. Therefore, on the following move, for example, after black's king move, that knight will be lost. Let's talk about a different subject now, that is the skewer. It's kind of similar a little bit to a pin, but it's still a different tactical motive. Here again, just like in the pin, the two black rooks in this case are lined up on the same diagonal, allowing white to attack the front rook. And what happens here is that when the piece in front is being attacked and it moves away, then the piece behind can be taken. So here again, black cannot avoid losing material. Of course, they don't need to lose a whole entire rook for nothing. Black could, for example, protect one rook with another, so at least after the bishop takes the rook could take the bishop. Remember, the rook is worth 5 points versus the bishop only 3. Therefore, it's a 2-point gain for white. A good thing. Moving on to the next example, we again learn about the skewer. Again, we need to find the two pieces that are on the same diagonal. I bet you can figure those out. Black's bishop and queen are lined up on the same diagonal. And now we can again use our bishop to make a skewer, attack the front piece, that is the queen, and if that moves away, then, for example, queen d5, white can just grab a bishop. In such situation, of course, we need to pay attention to the fact that the bishop should be protected, which in this case it is by our pawn on f2. So if the black queen would capture the white bishop, the pawn would capture back, bishop takes back, and of course, white is much ahead in material. And one more example on the theme of the skewer. In the position we see on the screen, white again can give a devastating check from black's perspective by playing bishop to e4, and as we can see, after the king moves away, the bishop is ready to capture the rook in the corner. And we're moving on to another subject that's one of my favorite in chess, and it's one of the most powerful tactical tools there is, and that is discovery. That's a very special tactical idea, and we will spend whole separate lessons on each of these tactical themes, but here I'm just demonstrating each of these ideas from the perspective of the bishop and showing how powerful bishops are and how bishops can be used. So in the position we see on the screen right now, white has special rook moves. If white moves the rook away anywhere, That would result in a check from the bishop to black's king. However, if that rook went to where I put it now, on d1, in reality, besides giving a check, which is not an accomplishment in itself, white really wouldn't achieve anything, and indeed, the king could just move out of the check, and nothing really happened. On the other hand, the beauty in discoveries is that you are allowed to put certain pieces on unprotected squares. For example, white is able to move his rook, in this case, on d7, again creating a discovered check to black's king by the bishop, and therefore not giving black the time to capture the rook that seemingly is unprotected. By the time black defends against the check by moving his king out, white captures black's queen and reaches a big advantage. And here is another example when we're using the bishop in the combination with the knight. The idea is literally the same as in the previous example. White is moving the knight from in between the bishop and black's king in a way to attack black's queen. And the move is knight f4 check. Black again is busy getting out of the check, and then white just captures the queen, reaching a winning position, being ahead a bishop and a knight. Now let's talk a little bit about when the bishop is not so good. In the position we see on the board right now is a very closed position. We call positions being closed when the pawn structure is blocked in, when pawns or many of the pawns cannot move. As you can see in this position on the board, none of the pawns can move, neither the white nor the black. They are blocked in, and there is no potential for any of these pawns to get exchanged. So in these situations, the bishop is quite useless because it cannot cross the wall of his own pawns. On the other hand, the knight is very flexible in closed such type of positions because the knight can jump around. It's the only piece that actually jumps over other pieces. In this case, black's knight can move to h4 and right away attack the base of white's pawn chain, and white will lose the pawn, and then black's pawn on g3 could become a queen. Let's move on to the next position. Well, this is a very basic position, but I think it's important that I point out that while the bishop is a very valuable piece, if you have only the kings and the bishop, it's an automatic draw. It is impossible to win a position when one side only has a king and bishop versus a king. Even if black would try to lose hard, they cannot. So this would be an automatic draw because it's impossible to imagine a checkmate position with only these three pieces. So therefore, make sure you try to keep some other pieces on the board in addition to your bishop. For example, if we would add just one pawn each, then the position would already be easily winning for white because white would eventually promote his pawn. For example, just to show you a couple of moves, white would bring the king around, and then either the king or the bishop would come and attack black's pawn. White would capture that pawn, and then with the help of the king and or the bishop, white's pawn eventually would get promoted, and then checkmate. And now let's see how the bishop can be used to checkmate. Well, here is one basic example. When the opponent's king is surrounded with his own pieces and is in the corner, the bishop can checkmate all by itself. And the move is, try to figure it out, bishop moving to d4. That's checkmate. The king has no moves, no piece can block the check, and neither can white's bishop be captured. Here is another example where even though black has a queen versus white's bishop in addition to kings and pawns, white can checkmate in one move. It's important to look at black's king and where can that king move right now. If we look at that, we'll notice that black's only king move would be to move to b7. Therefore, attacking the king, giving a check with bishop on e2 would not accomplish our goal because the king would move to b7. On the other hand, if we attack the king from the other side, at the same time we also control the potential escape square of the king on b7, and therefore this is checkmate. White's pawns cover the a5 or the a4 pawn, the b5 square, and therefore black has no escape. It is checkmate. And another example, when the two bishops work together beautifully. We saw an example of this already earlier, but here it's in a different way. The two bishops work together. The white colored or squared bishop controls that diagonal, which is especially important, the f7 and g8 potential escape squares of black's king, and the other bishop can actually deliver the checkmate along the dark squares with bishop h6. And finally, let's talk about how to use our bishops, how to develop our bishops in the opening at the beginning of the game. I'll show you two little openings, setups, where the bishops should be. One way is to develop them after some opening moves, for example, on c4. Typically, we try to develop them in a way when they attack central squares. For example, from c4, the bishop attacks the d5 square. Generally, d3 is not a bad square for the bishop either, because it would control the e4 center square. Moving the bishop to b5 would really be silly because black's pawn could block that check and attack the bishop right away, chasing it back. Therefore, that would be waste of time, so white should not do that. It would be also okay to develop the bishop to e2. It's perhaps not as active or maybe not ideal, but it's certainly reasonable. And finally, let's see one more example of a different development of the bishop, which we call fianchettoing the bishop, when the bishop tries to control the center but from the side. We achieve that by moving our knight pawn, the pawn that starts out in front of the knight. And then, for example, black can do the same, bishop g2. So the bishop here, even though temporarily the knight is blocking its way, the knight can always jump out of there, perhaps a bit later after we develop some more pieces, but the knight can go to the center e5 square and open up the diagonal of the bishop. Then, after black develops, we castle. Remember, putting your king to safety by castling is usually a very good thing, and you'd want to do within the first 6 to 8 moves of the game. Let's say black does the same, And now white has the option to develop the bishop, the other one, also to fianchetto, to b2, or the bishop could also move to f4, for example, attacking a center square, or you will see in some games, even of grandmasters, when the bishop would end up in a square like g5, especially when the opponent's knight already developed to f6. Well, this is it about the bishops. Of course, there is a whole lot more to learn about bishops, and we will in future lessons. But in the meantime, I think you get an idea what are the strengths and the weaknesses of bishops. Well, hope you enjoyed this, and we'll be back next week. Until then, so long.